Welcome back to The Situation Room, the show where you say, I'd like to watch the world burn, and we offer you our four-course taster menu of regional conflagrations. This week, we begin with the news out of Ukraine, where Russia appears to have started a massive summer offensive. Then we'll travel to Pakistan, where the nation's recent conflict with India appears to have led directly to the rise of a new strongman. And from Pakistan, we turn to the Chagos Islands, where the UK and the US have settled a long-running dispute over one of the world's most important military bases. And finally, we'll zero in on the nuclear negotiations between America and Iran, the prospect of a successful deal, and the possibility that Israel could go rogue while trying to prevent it. As always, timestamps below if you want to skip to a specific story, and let's get into it. On the battlefields of Ukraine, it's expected to be a cruel summer. Now the negotiations with Moscow have proven to be little more than a sham, and the Russian military has set and then broken several consecutive records for the size of its recent air assaults. Any hope of a quick reprieve from the fighting has all but vanished. Now, as we make its way to June, Ukrainian leaders are sounding the alarm on Russia's summer offensive. If the assault does indeed kick off in the region that Ukraine believes it will, then Russia could spend the next several months pushing against the largest population center that it's attacked in years. According to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky speaking with reporters on Tuesday, May the 27th, Russian forces are currently massing in the Kursk region, the same area where, until recently, Ukraine held a pocket of land in a limited counter-invasion of Russian soil. In Kursk, where many thousands of Russian troops had already responded to the Ukrainian assault, Zelensky and Ukrainian intelligence now estimate that a force of over 50,000 troops are massing for assault. Those troops are among Russia's strongest, and they'll be barreling down on a region called Sumy. There, a major city of the same name sits just 30 kilometers from the Russian border, with a pre-war population of over 250,000 people. Now, Sumy Oblast, the region, the city, is already in the process of evacuating, with somewhere upward of 60,000 residents believed to have been ushered out of the border zones already. The region has been under attack from Russian drones, and it's been no secret that in recent months that Ukraine has been concerned about attacks there following the withdrawal of most of its forces from Kursk. According to some within Ukraine's military and government, a direct attack on the city of Sumy is unlikely for now, but that's only true for so long as Ukraine can prevent Russia from getting into position. According to Zelensky himself, Ukraine has been preparing its defensive positions and believes itself able to prevent a large-scale offensive from succeeding. But all indications from the front lines would suggest that the Russian offensive has already begun. According to a range of independent war monitors, Russia has made a substantial push into the Sumy region over the span of the last week or two, capturing over 100 square kilometers of territory across the front by May the 27th, most of it in the Sumy region. That's Russia's best week of territorial gains since last December. By that same day, May the 27th, Russia had managed to capture a total of 4 villages in the Sumy region, although according to the regional governor, the residents of those villages were evacuated some time ago. Russian assaults have largely come by way of coordinated motorcycle attacks, swarming targets along a growing portion of the front, while those motorcycle troops are backed by unmanned drones. After a roughly 7-week stretch when Russian operations lowered in pace, the nation's forces have shifted their heavy equipment, built up supply depots, transferred important units, and stocked areas near the front lines with an unprecedented number of new recruits who've blown past Kremlin recruitment targets every month this year. Now, many of Russia's most potent forces appear to be deployed around Sumy, where an analysis by the Royal United Services Institute indicates that Russia's early motorcycle assaults will be followed by a high volume of small-scale attacks, escalating slowly in frequency and intensity and spreading across a larger and larger geographical area. The goal for Russia won't be to send massive armored columns in a decisive thrust, but to spread through Sumy like a wildfire through a forest in all directions at once, nearly impossible to contain. Depending on what Russia wants to achieve in Sumy, that could either be good news or bad news for Ukraine. After all, the Ukrainian defense will need to look different if it's predicated on the assumption that Russia wants to take the city than if it's based on assumptions that Russia wants to grab large patches of land or begin a siege or distract from a potential thrust someplace else. In this case, however, Ukraine doesn't need to guess, or at least it doesn't if it's willing to take Putin at his word. Putin himself has expressed the need to establish a so-called buffer zone along Ukraine's border with Russia, a stretch that Zelensky expects to be about 10 kilometers deep. According to Putin, those buffer zones would allow Russia to support operations on its own soil, where it prepares future attacks, and could use a buffer zone to insulate its internal operations from the reach of Ukrainian drones. Whether Russia would consider a direct assault on the city of Sumy afterward would likely depend on how easy it was to form a buffer zone, how many troops it could afford to commit, and how robust Ukrainian defenses were looking at that time. Regardless, an approach that uses a high volume of relatively small-scale spreading attacks across Sumy's borderlands is one that could allow Russia to take territory quickly once a few early footholds have been established. Just as important as understanding Russia's thrust into Sumy is understanding the broader balance of power across and on either side of the long front lines of this conflict. Some of the most intense fighting in Ukraine isn't even taking place in the Sumy region, but instead in the eastern Donetsk, where Russian troops still push toward the critical logistical hub of Pokrovsk. Troops amassing in Kharkiv and Zaporizhia, indicating what will probably be somewhat smaller offensives, but could still pose a considerable threat. Russia has been laying power lines in the occupied portions of Zaporizhzhia Oblast, indicating that it intends to connect the region's nuclear power plant to the Russian power grid and suggesting that Russia will embark on a localized offensive to push the front lines further from the plant. Moscow's forces have also taken to using a combination of several types of drones to attack Ukrainian logistics near the front lines, weakening undersupplied Ukrainian defenders in the most dangerous areas. Russia has kept up continual bombardment of Ukrainian cities and infrastructure, notching several of its largest missile and drone attacks of the entire war to date. In the opposite direction, Ukraine has continued to score a series of fewer, more precise hits against high-value Russian targets, from missile factories to semiconductor plants and more. But even in a situation where both Ukraine and Russia are scoring hits, and where neither nation really has much battlefield momentum, the fact that they're still fighting in so many different zones would primarily help Russia. The nation could force Ukraine to spread its exhausted defenders thin and cover many zones at once, meaning that Ukraine can't easily justify pulling assets from other areas in order to protect Sumy. That is especially important because when we turn back to the Sumy region, Russia's stated goals to create a buffer zone belie a far more devastating possibility. If Russia manages to establish that buffer zone 10 kilometers deep into Ukrainian territory, then that'll put the city of Sumy within range of the bulk of Russia's tube artillery, including its howitzer guns and multiple rocket launchers that Russia has in greatest numbers. That would allow Russia to begin shelling the city of Sumy directly, including densely populated areas of considerable value. In a worst-case scenario, if Russia were to force an unexpected breakthrough, its tube artillery could conceivably come into range of Sumy before a proper evacuation could take place. More likely, even if Ukraine is able to evacuate the city in time, Russian forces would be able to pound an economically vibrant Ukrainian provincial capital into dust. Not only would that deliver a major blow to Ukraine directly, but it would place even more pressure on this area of the front line, allowing Russia to pivot and exploit potential weak spots in all the other areas where Russia wants to make a push from Donetsk to Kharkiv to Zaporizhzhia. According to Rusi and other expert analysis, this is precisely what Russia will be hoping to achieve by claiming a large border zone in the Sumy region, especially if it can pressure the city directly. Russia's ultimate target does appear to still be the strategic town of Pokrovsk in the Donbass region, where a decisive Russian victory could lead to rapid progress in the eastern parts of the country. By creating intense pressure for Ukraine in several other areas at once, especially in parts of the country that haven't seen direct Russian assaults in a couple of years, Moscow can make it more and more difficult for Ukraine to justify keeping so many assets in the Donbass when they are simply needed elsewhere. Russia is, as usual, at a numeric advantage in this fight, and it's getting better at targeting the drone infrastructure that Ukraine has been using to make up the gap, meaning that it's Ukraine's human operators who are under even greater pressure to perform. And if Russia can cause a breakthrough in any of the areas it's attacking, then Ukraine in panic mode trying desperately to divert more of its troops to contain the damage will leave everywhere else even more vulnerable than it already was. Right now, both Ukraine and Russia are in a race against time. Ukraine is trying to present as staunch a defense as it possibly can for as long as it can before reserves of US-supplied equipment ultimately run out or until America's leaders can be convinced to resume their support. Russia is trying to produce major gains, notch decisive victories, and get as far as it can militarily before a combination of dropping oil prices, limited reserves of military equipment, and an overheated economy cause the bottom to fall out from under its entire invasion. But even though both combatants are up against the clock as well as each other, it's Ukraine's grim deadlines that will probably come first, and they could even be accompanied by a humanitarian crisis if hundreds of thousands more of its people are displaced from areas like Sumy Oblast. If all else holds steady and Washington maintains its current posture, Ukraine will face an existential crisis on the battlefield before Russia does. Russia appears to be fully aware of that fact and understands that now is the time for a major multi-dimensional push. Of course, there are no guarantees that Russia will be able to succeed in that effort. If it can't, then the nation's summer offensive may end like several prior offensives have, with limited territorial gains, if any, and thousands of lives lost in the process. If Ukraine can stonewall Russia in Sumy and stonewall in Pokrovsk and do the same in all the other areas where Russia seems as if it's about to start a push, then the nation may well force Russia to reconsider its calculus moving forward. Russia is up against a deadline too, and if Ukraine can demonstrate decisively that Russia can't achieve a breakthrough with what it has, then Russia's approach to the idea of a ceasefire might be very different in 6 to 12 months' time. But if Ukraine is going to have any hope of making that happen, then the nation's soldiers are going to have to endure hell in the meantime on multiple fronts. Just before we continue, should let you know we've got a brand new channel. It's called Political Fronts, obviously a sister channel to this channel, WarFronts, where we cover politics, obviously. Also, we've got a newsletter which goes out twice a week, keeping you up to date in between these Situation Room briefings. You'll find a link to both of those things, the new channel and the newsletter below. They're both free. Why not check them out? Thank you very much, and back to the video. Next up, we turn to the nation of Pakistan, where, in the wake of the nation's recent hostilities against India, winners and losers from the conflict are starting to emerge. Within the winner's circle, one name stands out above all the rest: the nation's newly promoted Field Marshal, Asim Munir. Munir's elevation to Field Marshal came just days after an international coalition managed to broker an India-Pakistan ceasefire, officially putting an end to the two nations' rapid escalation of hostilities. Munir, a 56-year-old Punjabi Muslim native of the major metropolis of Rawalpindi, is now only the second man to serve as Field Marshal in Pakistan's history. Granted the title by the nation's military and civil leaders, Munir was praised for his direct handling of the nation's military during the crisis. His promotion came, according to a statement by the Pakistani government, in recognition of the strategic brilliance and courageous leadership that ensured national security and decisively defeated the enemy. End quote. Now, typically, a military promotion like this wouldn't turn heads outside of Pakistan, and it's certainly not something we'd usually cover here on the Situation Room. But when we understand Field Marshal Asim Munir a little better, we can start to understand the magnitude of a larger change taking place in the country. A member of the Pakistan Army since 1986 and serving as the Chief of the Army Staff since 2022, Munir is widely recognized, in practical terms, as the most powerful man inside Pakistan. He's the former Director General of Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence and the nation's military intelligence, the former commander of the XXX Field Corps, and he's been the highest-ranking officer of the Pakistani military since he became Chief of the Army Staff. In Pakistan, where the military exerts exceptionally strong control over the nation's political leadership and its economy, the Chief of Staff of the Army is functionally a puppet master, pulling the strings behind Pakistani civil society. The major decisions that Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif makes are decisions that are run through Munir. When Pakistan spent the last few years sentencing former Prime Minister Imran Khan to a 10-year prison sentence, preventing him from becoming PM again and suppressing the resulting protests, it was Munir's hidden hand, and that of his inner circle, that ensured that the Pakistani government and law enforcement did as they were told. Pakistan's growing economy, its formidable military forces, and its 170-odd nuclear weapons are all ultimately subject to Munir's hold. Now, Munir's hold over Pakistan isn't absolute by any means, but when push comes to shove, in the highest levels of Pakistan's government, the military always wins, and for all intents and purposes, Asim Munir is the military. So, when Munir was elevated to the role of Field Marshal a couple of weeks ago, his promotion might have been fairly dismissed as an empty gesture. After all, there was no greater power in Pakistan for Munir to pursue beyond what he already had. While it's not unusual across many global militaries for generals to pat each other on the back with new stars and medals without there being much practical need, it's also a pretty unremarkable development, or at least it usually would be. But Munir's elevation to Field Marshal has come alongside an unprecedented surge in popular support for Pakistan's military leader, the sort of surge that only comes around maybe once in a generation. After the nation's conflict with India, public praise of Munir has gone from being consistently muted to a fever pitch. The polling group Gallup Pakistan found after the ceasefire that 93% of Pakistanis think more highly of the military now than they did before the crisis, and although the nation hasn't yet been polled on opinions of Munir specifically, he appears to have gotten much of the credit. Images of Munir have started popping up all across the nation. Banners and placards are spreading like wildfire as they declare him a savior, and Pakistan's social media is abuzz with praise for its de facto leader. As one Pakistani author, Aisha Siddiqa, explained in an interview with Reuters on the conflict's effects, we'll quote them here, "It has made the general stronger than any other previous generals. He is a hero now." For Munir to gain such public popularity in his nation, especially so quickly, represents an important shift within Pakistan for a few reasons at once. First, and perhaps most practically important, Munir has not been a widely loved figure during his tenure before now. In fact, he hasn't even been widely liked. In 2022, he endured the start of a political crisis when supporters of ex-Prime Minister Imran Khan ransacked military installations in a direct challenge to Pakistan's long-term de facto military rule. In 2023, he led crackdowns against Khan's political movement and jailed Khan personally, ultimately seeing him convicted and sentenced to a decade in prison just last year. Munir has been alleged of election rigging, he's presided over an economic crisis, and he was even briefly targeted for sanctions by the United States just a couple of months ago. But now, in the wake of Pakistan's highest stakes showdown in decades, it appears that Munir may end up being absolved of many of those prior sins. Even Munir's most entrenched domestic opponent, Imran Khan himself, heaped praise on the Pakistani military from prison in the aftermath of the exchanges with India. Longtime domestic critics of the Pakistan army, including elements from within Khan's party, now appear to be coming around, rapidly warming to the leader of a military that claims to have brought down several Indian fighter jets and ravaged numerous Indian bases via drone and missiles attacks. To grant Munir the title of Field Marshal isn't just icing on the cake, it's an act of punctuation. Munir is only the second Pakistani ever to receive the honour, alongside General Ayub Khan, who served as Pakistan's second president after taking power in a military coup and led the nation in an all-out war with India in 1965, where Pakistan gained air superiority. That's the symbolic light in which Munir has now been cast, and if the symbolism of the moments can give any indication about Pakistan's plans, then the clear conclusion is that Munir represents the future. For Munir himself, his elevation couldn't come at a better time. He's been working for years to frame himself as the formidable strongman opponent to India's own strongman, Narendra Modi, and as Modi has drawn deeper into Indian Hindu nationalism, Munir has done the same with Islam. Munir, who has personally memorized the entirety of the Muslim Quran, has described the long struggle between Pakistan and India as a struggle in all regards: tradition, religion, and ultimately strength. As he himself said in public statements just 5 days before the terror attack in Kashmir that ignited the most recent crisis, quote, "Our forefathers thought we are different from Hindus in every possible aspect of life. Our religions are different, our customs are different, our traditions are different, our thoughts are different, our ambitions are different." That was the foundation of the two-nation theory that was laid there. We are two nations. We are not one nation. Munir carefully cultivated a reputation as a hardliner and a warhawk, but also a man of personally unimpeachable character and religiosity, a reputation that's remained largely intact despite his many controversies leading the nation. In a practical sense, Munir is still a young leader who can be reasonably expected to have at least a decade or two of vigorous leadership in front of him to stand opposite an Indian leader nearly 20 years his elder. He is in his current post until at least late 2027, barring any surprise coups, and will be eligible to serve another 5 years after that in a nation where the military probably could ensure that he remains even longer if they saw fit to do so. He's already proven his ability to institute crackdowns, endure criticism, and aggressively push the agenda of a military that seeks to oppose westernization at home despite a more educated public and greater access to social media than ever before. He's already vanquished Imran Khan, probably the greatest political opponent that Pakistan will produce for at least a few more years, and he's made it abundantly clear that he can be trusted to advance the military's goals under any and all circumstances. The changes he sought to institute across Pakistani society, both internally and in its foreign policy, are already well underway, and none of the controversies that he's weathered thus far have been able to take him out. What all that means, taken together, is that Field Marshal Asim Munir is uniquely poised to be Pakistan's supreme leader for the long term. Whether he were to assume public office alongside his military role or continue guiding the nation's affairs from whatever shadows still obscure his post, he is the man that the Pakistani army would elevate as high as possible if it wanted to strengthen its long-term ability to rule Pakistan unilaterally. And now, with Munir and his reputation riding exceedingly high after the crisis with India, the Pakistani army has a unique opportunity to elevate Munir as high as it can, as quickly as it can, while public opinion is still on their side. Perhaps the combination of the Field Marshal title, the growing idolization of Munir nationwide, and the lack of any meaningful political alternative means that Pakistan is primed for a period in which the army assumes even greater control over everyday affairs. Perhaps we're seeing the start of a cult of personality here, and a direct elevation of Munir as an avatar for both the military and the nation of Pakistan overall, as he squares off personally against Narendra Modi. As the dust settles from the crisis, it's important to note one other lesson that the Pakistani government and its military may have learned. The people of Pakistan in 2025 seem to like it when their nation and their military can put India in its place. Where this dynamic is concerned, we can leave aside the fact that some of Pakistan's claims of victory may be stretched or overstated or fabricated outright. Quite frankly, we can leave aside whatever the hidden reality may have been about the exchanges between India and Pakistan, because, at least for now, reality is less important than perception when it comes to Field Marshal Munir. The truth of the matter aside, Pakistan's ability to engage India in an armed conflict and walk away claiming victory appears to have had a considerable positive effect for Pakistan's armed forces. But if that cause and effect relationship really does govern Pakistan right now, then that may rapidly become a problem for the entire region. If Pakistan's military believes that it can rapidly improve public opinion and garner public support by picking and winning a fight with India, and if it's led by a man who's personally benefited from that dynamic more than anybody else, then what does that mean for Pakistan's military going forward? In a worst-case scenario, it means that the Pakistani army now has real, proven incentives to engage violently with India in order to improve its domestic position, reacting to future internal crises by rallying Pakistan's people against a powerful external enemy. Each time it does, Pakistan and its leaders would place their people again into a head-to-head skirmish against a fellow nuclear-armed nation. Avoiding escalation was difficult enough for India, Pakistan, and the international community over the course of the last crisis. If crises were to happen more frequently, how long can the world truly keep on getting lucky and avoid that worst-case outcome? The elevation of Asim Munir is just one element of a rapidly shifting dynamic in South Asia. The future of the region's water supply, the rapid military expansion that's likely to come on both sides, and the political fortunes of Narendra Modi are just as important. But fighting against an Indian nation that's dominated by its political strongman, Pakistan now appears to have found its own strongman to meet him. In whatever chess match comes next, Munir and Modi will find all of South Asia to play for. In the normal course of things, the fate of 60-odd uninhabited islands in the Indian Ocean wouldn't attract much attention, but then there is nothing normal about the Chagos Islands. Part of the British Indian Ocean territory since the 1960s, the chain just happens to be home to one of the most important military bases in the Western Alliance. Jointly run by the UK and USA and operated from the island of Diego Garcia, the base is a key part of American power projection. From here, planes can take off on missions to the Persian Gulf or East Africa, bombers can hit targets in Iraq and Afghanistan, while intelligence teams can monitor vital shipping lanes. Should conflict with China break out, the base's ambiguous role as somewhere that may or may not store nuclear weapons also going to be really important. So yeah, Diego Garcia, kind of a big deal for Washington and London, which may be why the recent news caused such waves in defense circles. On Friday, May the 23rd, the UK government announced that it had signed a deal to surrender control of the Chagos Islands. Sovereignty would instead be handed to the African nation of Mauritius, which has long claimed the archipelago as its own. In return, Britain would be given a 99-year lease on Diego Garcia to keep the base running, a lease for which it would pay Mauritius roughly £100 million a year. As British Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer noted, this would come to a, quoting the BBC here, net cost of £3.4 billion after adjusting for factors including inflation. Now, if you're anything like the defence analysts who opposed the deal, you might be asking why the UK agreed to pay billions of pounds to hold on to something that it already had. And to answer that, we'll need to take a quick detour through the history of the Chagos Islands. A history that it's fair to say is best characterised as a touch contentious. Uninhabited for millennia, the islands finally got a permanent population with the arrival of the French in the early 18th century. Unfortunately, that population was mostly slaves who were shipped in to work on the plantations that France had established. This only changed with the endgame of the Napoleonic Wars, when the islands were added to the real estate of what would become history's biggest empire. 1814 was the date the control of the Chagos Islands officially passed to Britain, along with the island that we know as Mauritius. Although the former lay almost 2,400 kilometers from Mauritian shores, the French had administered the lot as a single colony to make things easier, a practice the British now inherited. After all, it's not like a mere bit of administrative paperwork could one day decide the fate of a vital British base. Right? Well, no, that's exactly what actually happens. When decolonization began across the globe some 150 years later, the UN explicitly ruled that former colonies could not be separated prior to independence. By then, though, both the British and the Americans were acutely aware of how valuable the Chagos Islands could be. So, in 1968, London did a deal with Mauritius. In return for £3 million and a security guarantee, Port Louis would surrender its claim on the Chagos archipelago. To the people at the time, it must have seemed like the perfect compromise. After all, it's not like Mauritius had ever ruled the islands, nor were they inhabited by Mauritians. The connection between the two had been a piece of colonial administration and nothing more. And so, the UK and the US got on with building their joint base on Diego Garcia, a base so sensitive they would deport the roughly 1,500 Chagosians living on the island chain, descendants of the slaves the French had originally brought over. Here's how The Economist describes the process. British authorities blocked families returning from trips, cut off the supply of teachers and doctors, gassed the island as dogs, and eventually deported anyone still left. The Chagosians mostly ended up in now independent Mauritius, where many faced such extreme poverty and discrimination that they wound up leaving. While some stayed, the rest went to either the Seychelles or to Crawley in England. There, the story could have ended had it not been for an incendiary claim later brought forward by Port Louis. In the Mauritian telling, the splitting off of the Chagos Islands had not been a simple deal done with their old colonial overlord. Rather, it had been the price Britain had demanded for Mauritian independence. Such a demand would, of course, have been a violation of international law, hence the cases Port Louis started bringing. Cases that culminated in a non-binding 2019 ruling by the International Court of Justice that the UK had broken the law, a ruling later backed by the Special Chamber of the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea. To call the diplomatic fallout from these rulings toxic would be a bit like saying the bomb dropped on Hiroshima caused some minor health issues. By 2022, most African countries had joined forces at the UN to create a united front against the UK on the subject. Over in America, the Biden administration started pressuring the Brits to come to some new agreement with the Mauritians that would recognize their sovereignty. But the real tipping point was the Russian invasion of Ukraine. For the broader West, the key argument against Moscow's land grab was that it violated international norms. So it was suddenly really rather awkward to have a nation that was a prominent Ukraine supporter also openly defying a UN ruling. And so, faced with growing international opprobrium, London at last began to talk with Mauritius over handing over the islands. Negotiations began under the brief premiership of Liz Truss, continued under Rishi Sunak, and were finally wrapped up by the current Prime Minister Keir Starmer. Although they were put on ice when Donald Trump won the US election, on the assumption that the 47th president would be against the deal, Trump wound up giving it his blessing. Indeed, when the UK signed the agreement with Mauritius, US Secretary of State Marco Rubio even declared, quote, "This secures the long-term, stable, and effective operation of the joint US-UK military facility at Diego Garcia, which is critical to regional and global security." Part of this upbeat assessment was to do with the concessions London extracted from Port Louis. Concessions that included a 38.6-kilometre buffer around Diego Garcia, an option to extend the lease by another 40 years once the initial century is up, and a right for the UK to veto the deployment of any military or civilian forces to any of the other islands in the chain. But it was also partly to do with fears of what would happen if London didn't make a deal. Beyond a loss of its soft power, the UK government feared real damage could be done if it tried to keep clinging to the archipelago. The BBC recently went into some depth on this. Although London could still appeal the ruling from the Tribunal of the International Convention of the Sea, losing that case would have legally obligated other nations to take action. This might have included countries between the US and Diego Garcia closing their airspace to planes headed for the base, or contractors who work there being opened up to lawsuits for travelling to the island. At worst, it could have killed the base's access to satellite communications since, to quote the BBC, the UK relies on a UN authority in Geneva to get access to a particular electromagnetic spectrum. Now, we should note here that international law these days is applied selectively at best. Hungary recently refused to arrest Benjamin Netanyahu despite an International Criminal Court warrant, instead withdrawing from the ICC during his visit. Sudanese paramilitary leader Hameti, meanwhile, took a trip to Kenya in the spring, despite Kenya's close ally America sanctioning the warlord and accusing him of genocide. We could go on, but you get the picture. International law only works if the majority of countries follow it, and the worry from some quarters is that Britain is hobbling itself by bowing to these rulings at a time when everyone else is ignoring them. As the Times of London thundered, no power on earth can dislodge the US and UK from Diego Garcia, and they would be within their rights to deal harshly with any attempt to interfere with communications or operations. Really though, the main argument against Britain handing over the Chagos Islands isn't based in realpolitik, but two worries that can each be summed up in a single word: precedent and China. Let's start with precedent. As the nation that once ruled an empire over which the sun never set, Britain still has a fair number of far-flung colonial possessions, little bits of strategic land which might now find themselves open to similar legal challenges. Among these, the most likely to face a challenge off the back of this agreement are the Falkland Islands, claimed by Argentina. But there are also fears that Spain may try to get a ruling in its favour on Gibraltar. In both those cases, a UN tribunal would have to deal with local populations who very much want to maintain their current status. Yet the same might not be true for the sovereign military bases the UK maintains on the island of Cyprus. Nor is the UK the only nation that's vulnerable. The French possession of Tromelin Island is also claimed by Mauritius. More to the point, the case has demonstrated that Britain is vulnerable to these sorts of lawsuits. And that's a big deal if you're of the view that the Mauritian case was far from watertight. That's the opinion of Royal United Services Institute Senior Research Fellow Dr. Jack Watlin, who wrote back in October that, quote, "What Mauritius has done is successful lawfare, creating a diplomatic problem to try to gain control of economically valuable territory that it wants to exploit." According to Dr. Watlin, Port Louis was aided in this by states hostile to the UK, including Russia, which pressed its allies to support the Mauritian case. In his telling, quoting him here, Russia saw this issue as a way of imposing costs on the UK, and it seems to have succeeded. Now, if true, this would mean that any enemy of Britain just got the green light to start burying London under spurious lawsuits. Of course, those of you watching from non-British countries might find all of this just a little bit hard to care about. The same is unlikely true regarding the other big concern, though, and that's China. As the South China Morning Post notes, Beijing maintains close relations with Port Louis. The fear is that China might leverage these relations to get close to the joint base on Diego Garcia. In his article, Dr. Watlin pointed out that Mauritius has gained the right to grant fishing access near the base, and China's fishing fleets are routinely equipped with sensors for snooping on other nations. And then there's the level of control Mauritius has gained over Diego Garcia. Speaking on BBC Radio 4, former Security Minister Tom Targenhat claimed that the agreement obligated the British government to inform Port Louis of any activity taken from the base. The Mauritian government in hock to China could then relay all that information back to Beijing without any need for old-fashioned spying. However, we should point out that there are many who claim the Mauritian link to China is overblown. After all, Mauritius is one of the few nations in the region not to have yet joined the Belt and Road Initiative, although there are ongoing talks. Yet even if Port Louis changed its name tomorrow to Xi Jinping is awesome, there are reasons to believe that Mauritius still wouldn't be in China's pocket. Chief among them is the fact that Mauritius is already closely connected to one of China's regional challengers, India. A small nation of 1.26 million, Mauritius has always been in need of powerful friends, hence its decades-long snuggling up to New Delhi. As The Economist points out, the island's national security advisor is Indian, its coast guard is equipped by India, and it's already allowing India to construct a probable naval base on the island of Agalega. At the risk of sounding like that old goodness gracious me sketch where the dad claims everything is Indian, Mauritius at this stage is almost as Indian as they come, And that means that the major beneficiary of the Chagos Islands deal may not be the world's most powerful Winnie the Pooh lookalike, but the government in New Delhi. Right now, the Indian Ocean is becoming an arena of global competition, with China starting to encroach on one side and the West already with its footholds on the other. Caught in the middle, India is watching some of its closest allies like the Maldives and Sri Lanka openly flirt with Beijing. So, to have a vital chain of islands handed over to a nation that's so dependent on it, maybe no bad thing. The Chagos Islands, then, may be entering into a new stage in their story, assuming, of course, that the UK Parliament ratifies the agreement. But even under new ownership, it seems that this tiny archipelago will lose none of its geopolitical significance. For a long time, Diego Garcia was key to Britain and America projecting power. In the near future, the neighbouring atolls may prove just as important for India. And finally, we visit the nation of Iran, where after a bumpy negotiation process, a new nuclear deal with the United States might finally be imminent. According to leaders from both the US and Iran, the details of a potential plan have started to emerge, with nothing less than the fate of the Middle East hanging in the balance. Last Friday, an Iranian and an American delegation met in Rome for a fifth round of talks aimed at establishing a nuclear deal, and while the two sides left without a resolution, something strange happened as the talks were wrapping up. For the first time in a very long time, both Iran and America seem to be looking positively on the talks that just happened. According to Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, quote, "We have just completed one of the most professional rounds of talks. We firmly stated Iran's position. The fact that we are now on a reasonable path, in my view, is itself a sign of progress." On the other side, US President Donald Trump seemed to agree, telling reporters 2 days later, quote, "We've had some very, very good talks with Iran, and I don't know if I'll be telling you anything good or bad over the next 2 days, but I have a feeling I might be telling you something very good." Unfortunately, at the time of writing, that 2-day deadline has already passed, but anonymous high-level American officials have confirmed to the global press that the mood is decidedly optimistic. By all accounts, Iran and the United States appear to have moved past a majority of their prior sticking points and are both working seriously in good faith to reach an agreement. Iran is working hard to avoid a United Nations deadline that will trigger the reimposition of a crush of sanctions that have been temporarily lifted, and it's trying to get the United States on its side to prevent a feared Israeli attack on Iran that Jerusalem wouldn't dare carry out if Washington explicitly told it not to. On the other hand, the United States under Donald Trump considers a new nuclear deal with Iran to be a key foreign policy objective alongside the task of finding resolutions to the Ukraine and Gaza wars. The first 4 rounds of mediated talks got nowhere, owing to Iran's insistence that it be allowed to continue enriching uranium to power civil nuclear reactors, whereas the US has demanded a permanent zero enrichment policy. But round number 5 appears to have led to a real set of breakthroughs, and already the potential terms for a deal are coming into focus. For Iran's part, the nation appears to be willing to accept limits on its levels of enrichment in exchange for ironclad guarantees from Washington that it won't go back on a nuclear deal once the deal has been established. That's a critical lesson learned by Tehran after prior negotiations over the Obama-era deal, which Trump reversed during his first term. Iran has also made clear that a true zero enrichment policy won't be possible, but it seems as if the cracks in that facade may be starting to show. According to US Secretary of State Marco Rubio, the US is willing to establish an arrangement where Iran does have a civil nuclear program but doesn't enrich uranium itself. According to insider accounts, one potential compromise may be for Iran to source its uranium from a consortium of Middle Eastern nations backed by the United States, importing that uranium after it's already been enriched to the requisite levels. Other nations, as well as the International Atomic Energy Agency, have reportedly made direct offers of low-enriched uranium for Iran's peaceful use. That's an arrangement that was previously considered and then thrown out during the Obama negotiations in 2010, but this time, the greater geopolitical pressure on Iran may be enough to prompt the nation to accept the terms. Notably, any deal where Iran sources its uranium internationally would provide the rest of the world with real leverage over the nation for the long term. If Iran engages in behaviors that its uranium suppliers don't like, potentially including any number of behaviors Iran regularly engages in today, then it would be subject to coercion to change those behaviors as an external partner or consortium threatens to withhold uranium in the future. But it's critical to understand the differences in stakes for Iran in this current round of talks as compared to the previous Obama-era discussions. The American administration in Washington has threatened direct military action against Iran if a deal can't be reached, vowing to destroy Iran's nuclear program by force if necessary. America has built up a considerable air power presence to surround Iran in the region, deploying powerful F-15 strike aircraft in the Middle East and stationing 4 B-52 and 6 stealth B-2 strategic bombers, plus ample refueling tankers at the military island of Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean. If America pulled the trigger, its assets are well within range to launch an attack with near immediate effect. Not only that, but US ally Israel is even more interested in striking Iran than America is. According to reporters from within the White House, the US is increasingly worried that Israel could unilaterally bomb Iran's nuclear sites or other military locations if talks break down, and according to Axios, there's even concern that Jerusalem could strike without American approval. It's worth asking, of course, whether those concerns are real on the part of the United States or whether this is more of a geopolitical show, with America making it clear that it can just barely contain the enraged attack dog straining against its leash. For Iran, however, the distinction may not actually matter. Whether America's concerns over Israel are genuine or for dramatic effect, Iran's choice to agree on terms is an existential decision either way. Both sides agree that there are continued sticking points, especially Iran's handling of the highly enriched uranium that it already possesses. Iran has been a couple of weeks away from having the uranium it needs to build a nuclear weapon for many months now. But despite the occasional confusion we've seen in our own comment section, it's important to understand that that is by design. Instead of building a bomb that would trigger a foreign military attack, Iran has carefully built up a breakout capability, which is basically the geopolitical equivalent of your older sibling picking their nose and sticking it right in your face and saying, I'm not touching you. The fact that Iran could at any moment start the final push to have weapons-grade uranium at its disposal was already a significant deterrent, and it's one that Iran will be hesitant to give up if it doesn't absolutely have to. The fate of Iran's ballistic missile program is an equally sensitive subject, as is the question of what Iran would do with both its missiles and its highly enriched uranium if it did choose to give them up. In the case of the uranium, Iran would likely have to hand it over to another nuclear nation, whereas for the ballistic missiles, it might be compelled to destroy them. But as painful as those considerations may be, it seems as if Iran may be willing to accept. As Foreign Minister Ariichi wrote on X before the talks, quoting here, "Zero nuclear weapons equals we do have a deal. Zero enrichment equals we do not have a deal. Time to decide." Although the world doesn't yet know what Iran and the US were able to decide, the agreement by both nations that things are moving in the right direction would suggest that something major has been decided. And while Iran's supreme leader has kept up a fiery opposition to the idea of stopping uranium enrichment, the supreme leader's PR statements often reflect a hardline approach long after his own negotiators have gotten the green light to cross certain boundaries in private discussions. The Supreme Leader's public position is more a matter of optics, shown to the Iranian people, and especially its many religious hardliners, than a reliable reflection of his real stance on a given issue. One compromise that both sides could get behind could be a provisional agreement that's reportedly in discussions, where Iran would freeze its enrichment for 3 years, although not discontinue it completely, and the global community would partially lift sanctions. That's an approach that worked before during the Obama-era negotiations, when a 2-year provisional agreement paved the way for a final deal. Look, at the time of writing, Iran and the US have yet to agree on a date for their upcoming 6th round of talks, but both sides seem to agree that the 6th round is imminent. The Israeli government is reportedly pushing hard against the US decision to continue negotiating, as Israel seems to believe that its military window of opportunity to strike Iran is closing. But with the relationship between Netanyahu and Trump seeming to fray more and more every week, it's unlikely at this stage that Netanyahu would be able to convince Trump to reverse course. Israel's threat of direct military action against Iran will remain potent and may even force Iran into compromises that it wouldn't otherwise agree to. But Israel does not appear to have the power to force America away from the negotiating table. As for the rest of the Middle East, the stakes and the benefits of a potential negotiating breakthrough could not be higher. After the Obama-era deal fell apart in 2018, Iran pivoted into a new geopolitical strategy in support of its axis of resistance, non-state actors including Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthi rebels of Yemen, Hamas, and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad in Gaza, the government of Syria under Bashar al-Assad, and more. That strategy has led to wars and crises all across the Middle East in which Iran has funded and enabled untold death and destruction because it comprised the nation's strategic response to the collapse of the former nuclear deal and the imposition of maximum sanctions by much of the world. The collapse of that Obama-era deal is impossible to separate from all that's happened in the Middle East since then, as an Iran that's been iced out of the international order has turned to subterfuge, and attempts to undermine the competition. But now in 2025, Iran's axis of resistance has largely been destroyed. Hamas barely hangs on in Gaza. Hezbollah is a shadow of itself. Assad has fallen in Syria, and many of its militias in the Middle Eastern desert have quietly chosen to quit the fight. With so much of its work undone, Iran is in a difficult spot, having to justify to its own people a costly, self-alienating geopolitical strategy that ultimately didn't work. On the world stage, it's on the brink of having to make its pariah status permanent, something that it would likely have to do if it became clear that sanctions relief was never going to happen. But the United States and the international community can offer Iran a once-in-a-lifetime off-ramp. By taking a nuclear deal, even under difficult terms, Iran can achieve major sanctions relief. It can gracefully take the opportunity to bow out of its ongoing engagements with Middle Eastern resistance groups. It can claim to its own hardliners that it was able to force America back to the table, and it can give up the nuclear program that's placed a Tel Aviv-style target on the Ayatollah's forehead. It's a shaky pretense, built on a combination of half-truths, self-aggrandizement, and outright lies, but it'll do. And if Iran were to take this off-ramp while it's available, then the nation may well be able to chart a better path forward, one that leads to economic reintegration, internal stability, and maybe, someday, far in the future, a better Middle East for everybody. All that goes away if Iran can't come to terms. But today, nearly a full decade after the former nuclear deal was agreed, Iran and America are closer to a new nuclear deal than they've been since the start of the Trump era. Let's hope that they can get across the finish line. Thank you for watching.